So now let's have our guest speaker. I have Malcolm Hollensteiner, who is Director of Retail Lending at TD Bank. I've known Malcolm for many years. He was previously a regional manager with PNC in that city, started out at Waterfield Bank, has had a long career in mortgage banking, and he's a certified mortgage banker. One of the interesting things about Malcolm is that Malcolm was a basketball player on the Harvard basketball team, so I know when March Madness starts, he's definitely excited and interested.
I think what the key to onboarding is to have complete buy-in from all partners in a company that supports the mortgage business. So whether you're with a bank or an independently owned company, having your partners on the human resources side, the technology side, the product side, et cetera, have them come together and understand the crucial importance of having a great introduction to an organization. So I think the first is obviously buy-in and support of your partners, that, because we know that behind every great originator and behind every great production team is a lot of back office and front office individuals who play a very important role in defining a company's success. So that to me is the partnership and having an organized approach to onboarding in order to minimize any of the potential challenges that can come up. Because we know that with all onboarding experiences, there are going to be bumps in the road. And how an organization handles those initial bumps, I think, helps provide greater confidence and clarity to a newcomer as far as what this new organization means to them.
So Malcolm, from your viewpoint, and I guess I'm interested to hear, and part of what I was trying to paint in the beginning of the presentation was that obviously managers are selling at a fever pace, but once a new candidate has joined you, oftentimes what you end up seeing is just selling starts, and it's more of, okay, get your act together. In the meantime, I'm going off to recruit more people. And so therefore, there's no real selling that continues. There's not a reselling of the strategy and the culture side of it. What do you see as kind of what's behind all of that, and why do managers end up doing that?
Well, I think that there's probably the sense of urgency, which is, I think, both a factor of the organization and the individual originator, which is, the time spent outside of selling results in fewer immediate loans. So I think that when all new originators come to a new place, they're bringing with them customers who want to take immediate action in terms of applying for a mortgage. So there's probably, and that's obviously encouraged by the new employer because they want to see production. So you get this challenging situation where you've got an originator, they just want to start originating new loans on day one. You want a new employer that wants to see the revenue coming in from day one. So
right.
It's important to kind of establish the guidelines so that although immediate production is not neglected or overlooked, but there's a sense that there are other things that are as important, if not more important, to someone's success long-term with an organization. And those factors need to be discussed and reviewed from day one.
Right. Do you think managers want to have that type of conversation with a new employee? In other words, kind of they see their role many times as just, let me recruit them, and when the person comes there, it's kind of up to them to figure out what's going on.
I think there's definitely a tendency in our business to bring someone in, show them the desk, and say, hey, go out and sell. I'm going to go recruit more people. I think when you look at the onboarding path, the three things that are critical, besides obviously establishing the tools for an originator to go out and to be successful in terms of doing business. But I think there are three other situations or three other factors that need to be discussed. One is are you exposing your new employee to the culture? Are you able to define the culture of the new organization to the new originator? Secondly, which is I think crucial in today's day and age, is are you able to adequately express to your new employee what your organization's risk culture is and what the risk appetite is, because often during the recruiting phase, risk is not necessarily a topic of conversation because it's not necessarily an attractive topic of conversation. So making sure that your new originator understands what the company will do and won't do in terms of risk is very important. And the third factor that I think is as important as anything else during the onboarding, the initial onboarding, is to make sure that your new employer really understands what your firm's value proposition is, because the value proposition, which is a cliche that can be used in many different ways, value proposition, understanding and having a pure or clean definition of value proposition, I think helps that originator, number one, feel more comfortable with his or her new surroundings, but number two, also helps tie in everything else that they're working on and being exposed to during those first few weeks.
Right. Well, don't you think, and certainly what I see when I'm consulting is that because most of the originators are 20, 25 years in the business, they've been at 5 or 6 companies, that the new lender just assumes that, their company looks like, the next company, when the reality is the cultures can be completely different. And that's very true when you move from an independent mortgage company and you go into a bank. A bank has a whole method of looking at things that's so much different than independent mortgage bankers. And since you've been on kind of both sides of it, kind of what's been your experience with that?
Well, I think that's a great point, Pat, because I think that comes down to when someone's making that transition from a non-depository owned parent company to a bank-owned mortgage lender. There is a cultural shift there, and it might even be a cultural shock for new originators, even if they've been in the industry for 20 to 30 years. And so that's where, tying in the culture, the risk appetite, the value proposition, it's really important to get into the weeds very early on in the onboarding process so that the new originator understands what is different in their new environment compared to their old environment. And, there are cultural changes, whether you're going from large to small, small to large,
Right.
mortgage banker to money center bank, et cetera. There are cultural changes that really will play an important role, whether positive or negative, in how successful an originator is with that new employer. So really identifying those differences and not comparing and contrasting, but making sure that everyone understands what the model is and why the model was set up this way. That's something that, as an industry, I think we struggle with, and it's very important that we improve in it.
Well, you raised a really great point, and I do think, especially in these times when, people are chasing after originators, that many times this issue during the interview process never really gets addressed. And so then when you onboard them, you kind of ignore it too, and before you know it, you're now 6 and 9 months down the road, and the person really is either not happy or not successful, or a series of different reasons. But the truth of the matter is that the onboarding process, which would be your second checkpoint to make sure this is the right match, too often companies are delaying that, and and managers in particular are delaying it when they really need to address it as soon as possible. What have you seen kind of work in your years of mortgage banking with the onboarding process? That what do you suggest that would be things that people could put in place today that are on the webinar?
Well, I think there's two important parts of the onboarding. One is what I would call the partnership,
Sure.
which I alluded to earlier, which is who is the individual and department that is owning the onboarding experience, and that ownership shouldn't necessarily rest or lie with the sales side of the house. It should be more of a back office ownership, so that it's a concisely and disciplined exercise. So, whether that's human resources, whether that's a separate sales and support function, there needs to be a sales responsibility and involvement and even ownership to make sure that deadlines are met, to make sure that all actions are detailed and are executed on. So that's the first part. The second part, obviously, is, what type of ownership and leadership is there from the sales side? Is it the direct manager? Is it a regional manager? Is it even someone above a regional manager who plays a role in onboarding on the sales side? So you need to have onboarding owned by both sides of the organization to really make sure that the originator understands his or her responsibilities and policies from both the sales side and from the operational and just the parent company side of it. So it's not something, onboarding is not an activity that can be led by one individual. It needs to be consistent, and there needs to be not only some thought going into the onboarding, but also some resources put behind it. And then there also, to your point, there has to be a clear-cut accountability factor, which is, these are the expectations that are set for the new performer, and how are we going to measure that these expectations are being realized?
So when you look at it, I guess, from a practical standpoint, most companies define onboarding as strictly, here I'm going to teach you how to get on the computer system so you can handle a loan. Obviously, what I'm saying today is that that really isn't what needs to be conveyed, because the person it's like buying something and have buyer's remorse. In the first 90 days, that person, that originator is making a determination like, wow, did I make the wrong decision? And I think what I certainly see at companies that when they make it just get on the computer system and I'll show you how it works so you can keep doing your business, that they haven't used the period where the person's trying to figure out, was this the right decision for me? And what you're trying to do from a company standpoint is emotionally tying the individual to your firm. And instead, what's going on is the person has to figure out what that is themselves. I mean, has that been your experience?
Yeah, I think what I've noticed firsthand experience is the primary struggle is both what type of consistency and dedication to this is coming from the organization,
right?
But then also from the originator's involvement, what type of flexibility and what type of commitment is coming from the originator, because obviously getting onboarding correct is important. You want to reduce the potential mishaps and errors that occur, but there are going to be bumps in the road, and so if an originator loses his or her cool in the first day or two because there's an issue with the laptop, is it unproductive to have a faulty laptop? Sure, it's unproductive, but how that originator handles that type of challenge, I think, gives you a great insight as to how successful they will or they won't be. And also, are there some personality issues that you have to watch out for and that you have to manage through? So I think it comes down to, it's a two-way street. The organization has to do their part, but the individual contributor also has to play along as well.
Yeah, that's really a great point, which leads to really my next question. When you're looking again, and part of what I was saying today was, what happens during that first 90 days is really a critical indicator of what the success is going to be of the originator. And so what ends up happening is that oftentimes what I see, the manager really doesn't know what's going on at that originator level, and so whether the person's going to make it or not kind of drags on. And so therefore you're having to face these decisions 9 months down the road, when really in the first 90 days there were kind of early signs that a mistake was made, but for whatever reason they don't get addressed by the manager. So has that been your experience, that the individual manager many times just assumes that that some of these early warning signs are, basically don't really matter, and what matters, you have to look at 9 months of performance? Is that kind of what you see?
I think it is, and I think it also probably comes down to, especially on the bank side, the bank-owned mortgage company side, where from an HR perspective, it's a challenge to terminate someone, even if they're the wrong employee, and you know that within a couple of days after hire.
Right.
So I think it's obviously, whether depending on your organization's philosophy as to how you compensate new originators to your team, and kind of what type of goals you set or you don't set, managing that individual within a 30, 60, 90-day, 180-day process, it is easy to overlook a lot of potential landmines based on production. I mean, if you have a new originator who comes on board and they're taking 10 apps for $5 million their first month, most organizations are only looking at that production, and they're not looking at anything else, which might be all the baggage that originator has brought to the organization. So it's a challenge, because in an industry like ours, where production is king, you gotta produce. But we know that the squeaky wheel often gets the grease, and unfortunately, with top producers, especially during the onboarding process, there's a lot of grease being provided.
So have you had, in your experience, in other words, I had talked about the learning side, and certainly what I see in the industry every day is that, selling itself has changed. And so one of the indicators of someone that really is not adapting to what is required to be successful in sales is their ability to learn and change. And when they're not wanting to attend training, when they're not wanting to improve themselves, when there is no learning plan for them and they're not responsible, they really aren't responding well to even having a learning plan. What do you think of that situation? In other words, the person's indicating, okay, I'm not going to adapt, here's what I am, and this is it, and not willing to really match to what is being required today.
You mean to say, Pat, that in our industry there are originators who don't want to go to training classes and
oh, yeah.
company procedures? You learn something new every day.
Oh, yeah, I have that experience quite a bit, so I know that story, so sure.
I think that's a great question, and I think that's where you have to be consistent, and you have to, hopefully during the hiring process, the courtship, you get to understand and know the person you're hiring and kind of what their goals are and what they like to do and don't like to do. I mean, we know that a lot of producers are lone wolves, and they like to be out by themselves. They're a pack of one, and they view anything that impacts their ability to go out and sell, they view that as an impediment to their success. So it's a tough question, and I think it happens every day in the industry, which is making sure that people follow the rules. And I think probably where we have to do a better job in the industry is not necessarily getting them to comply, but making sure our originators understand why we have these guidelines and why complying makes good business sense. So it's probably more looking at what's the underlying problem with why originators are hesitant to, quote unquote, take time out of the sales day to comply with corporate policies, and making sure that they understand that there are policies for a reason, and these policies are actually going to help you be successful and navigate the industry in this, post-Dodd-Frank CFPB time.
Right. I mean, certainly what I see is actually, and getting away from the compliance training side of it, but what I see is that your top originators are the ones that I would rather have in a class. Now, obviously, it means the instructor has to be high level, but the truth of the matter is they're the people from a training perspective that will go back and actually implement, whereas when you look at using training as something as a way to resolve people that are underperformers, it really isn't a training issue. It's basically a self-motivational issue. So from a training perspective, I'm always of the opinion that the General Electric way is the way training should be handled, and that is that training, sales training I'm talking about, should be to your top 50%. Your bottom 50% have really other issues, and those issues training really will not correct. And actually, they're the ones that tend to resist it from my own experience. Is that what you've seen also?
You hit the nail on the head with that one. That's very good statements to make.
Right. Well, we have a couple questions here, Malcolm, from the audience that they're interested in your view of, in the first 90 days, what type of performance activities should be looked at? Is it realistic about the ride-alongs? Why don't you share kind of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of performance, I think for new hires, organizations, a lot of organizations that I know that I've worked for in the past, and today probably even more so than previous years, they understand there's a ramp-up period for a new originator, and that ramp-up period can be market-specific, can be experience-level specific. So I think there's a ramp-up period, which, whether that's 90 days or 60 days or 120 days, where the focus isn't so much on production as it is making sure the employer is comfortable with their new surroundings and also begins a process of understanding what's expected of him or her and understands the climate that they're operating in. Once you get past that initial ramp-up period, then the next question that management has to ask is whether the originator is quote-unquote seasoned or tenured, and then is expected to produce at the minimum standards as is every tenured or other seasoned originator for the organization. So, the first two phases that you have to look through is, the pure ramp-up period, what's expected during the pure ramp-up period, and then after the ramp-up period concludes, what type of minimum standards do you view that originator? And I think there has to be consistency with a minimum level of production for new hires, but then I think it comes down to the individual manager, and are they raising the bar for someone at an accelerated rate compared to other hires? Because we know that all hires are not going to be the same. If you're hiring pure rookies into the industry, that's a completely different ramp-up period and a completely different level of production expectations. If you're hiring seasoned professionals who are bringing a big book of business and are able to hit the ground running, you're obviously going to be looking at different production levels for them. But I think we all do get caught up in, the immediate production and being either disappointed by someone's production out of the gate, lack of production, or being so excited by someone's production out of the gate that you overlook some potential shortcomings and danger spots that we ignore because production looks so good.
That's a really great point. I have another question from someone on the webinar today, and they're asking about, considering the person is a veteran and you recruited them from another company, is it fair to say that 30 days, 60 days, in other words, what should be that time period from your viewpoint that needs to be kind of really emphasized?
Well, I think that's where each organization has to look in the mirror and
Sure.
really do a check on how successful they are or they are not in terms of onboarding, because, I would think that history has shown us that organizations that do a really good job of onboarding are able to, even if their training sessions last longer than their competitors, they're able to have their originators contribute at a faster rate because those originators have more confidence and understanding of their new system. So I think it really is, before you, as an organization, you spend a lot of time setting minimum production standards based on experience level. I think you really have to spend some time at, looking underneath the hood of the truck, of the engine, as far as what type of onboarding program do we have, what type of tools and resources do we have available, and how good of a job are we explaining culture, how good of a job are we explaining risk appetite, and how good of a job are we explaining value proposition.
Yeah, really great point. I guess, Malcolm, just in our last few minutes, if you could just maybe share with everyone today, what would be kind of your, biggest takeaway when it comes to onboarding, that what you have seen has worked, and how to make that happen when you're actually managing and recruiting at the same time?
I think that is simply stated, the biggest thing is making sure that there's a combined ownership between sales and support. And support can involve, all back office and, non-customer facing areas of the organization. But I think you have to have that joint ownership, that joint partnership. Let's face it, you might have the world's greatest branch manager or area manager who's hiring and recruiting and helping to onboard originators, but that individual should be expected to own, the laptop ordering and, the training, class scheduling, and compliance testing, et cetera. So there's got to be really good coordinated effort. And I think on the sales side, it's really crucial for sales to impress upon their partners in the organization how important the first few days, first few weeks of the new hires, the new hires start with an organization, how important it is to put the best face forward and to make sure that originator feels comfortable and confident with their decision to change firms.
Right. That's a really great point, and I certainly appreciate you joining us today.